the money that you have, the currency in a gold standard is convertible into gold. So people can come to the government and say, hey, I'd like to redeem this dollar. Please give me some gold. And if the government doesn't have enough gold to be able to do that for everybody who comes to ask, then they've got a big problem. Like the system falls apart. One way that the government could try to prevent that was basically to lock up this money so that people couldn't convert it into gold. And the way they do that is by selling treasury bonds. You sell a bond, so you take the currency away from somebody and you give them another piece of paper that is almost identical but says, security on it instead of currency, and it's not convertible into gold. So now they basically still got the money, but in a form that's not convertible into gold. So your gold is a little bit safer, right? So in that system, the government it's like the government has a vested interest in selling these bonds, getting them out there and taking currency out of circulation as much as it can to keep its gold safe. Today, we don't have any of that. You want to hold your savings in currency or you want to hold them in treasury bonds? Like, the government doesn't care. If you get people to realize that the money is not a chunk of gold, it is a relationship. It's an IOU. It's this debt between you and government. It's a coupon that the government issues. Then, that kind of evaporates. Like, you say the government should not print money. Well, what do you mean? Like Macy's shouldn't sell coupons? Like, what do you mean? It's like...
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. For as little as $1 a month, you can get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. A big thank you to all our patrons so far. A quick announcement before we start. I'm doing a show in London near King's Cross on the 3rd of December 2019 at 7 p.m. to see if I can present MMT in an entertaining way for people who are completely new to it. And the reason I'm trying to drum up a small audience for it is because I need the pressure of a deadline to force me to write it. I've got some bare bones ideas, but there's nothing like a real deadline. So if you're seasoned at MMT, it won't be designed to teach you anything you don't already know. It's just something I've been working on because that's my work community. I do shows here and there and at arts festivals, and I'm trying to make that world and the world of MMT meet and hopefully get more people on board by being able to take the show to where people are. So it's on Tuesday, the 3rd of December 2019 at 7 p.m. at a venue called 2 North Down. There's a ticket link in the show notes. It's free admission. And I think I can guilt trip Patricia into coming. So if you come along with a patient, sympathetic mindset, even if the show's not in great shape, we can at least have a bit of a social afterwards. So I hope to see you there, but it really is early work in progress, so no pressure. At the beginning there, you heard our guest this week, Sam Levey of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, discussing his recent working paper, Modern Money and the War Treasury, which focuses on the US Treasury during World War II. This is part 2 of our conversation, so I'd strongly advise you listening to part 1, episode 32, if you haven't already. One big takeaway from examining this history is the function of war bonds, because it's conventional wisdom that governments sell bonds to raise money that they don't have so they can spend that money on things, goods, services, raw materials, real things that the state needs to provision itself. But through the MMT lens, this makes no sense at all. And even if you've never heard of MMT, I don't think it's a stretch to understand that in modern fiat currency systems, when governments spend, they don't push gold coins into tubes and then suddenly a recipient has a higher bank balance on the other end of the tube. Instead, the way it works is that governments issue new pounds or dollars or yen out of thin air when they spend. So bond issuance can't be about raising money. And you can check out our early episodes for more on where currency comes from. Spoiler alert, it's issued by monetarily sovereign governments. So during World War II, when all the real resources of the US, including labor, were being fully employed to fight the war, all the money being spent into existence to employ these resources was potentially about to meet a very limited supply of goods, because factories that in peacetime might have been making, say, cars, were now directed towards making munitions and tanks, which were being shipped out of the country and used to fight the war. So when people are trying to buy things, but there's a limited supply of things, this can bid up prices and cause massive problems domestically. So the challenge is how to limit people's spending power. Well, the government could raise taxes on the population, take some of the currency out of circulation, but also another way to do it is to get people to defer their spending until a time when the supply comes back to a level that the increase in demand can cope with. So war bonds were a way to lock away the consumer's money until after the war. And to attract people to buy them, the government offered a rate of interest. So going back to Sam's point at the beginning, when nations were on a gold standard, bond issuance was about defending the nation's gold supply and being able to guarantee that your dollar bill or your pound note would be worth what the government was promising it would be worth in terms of gold. But when nations went off the gold standard, that all changed. And you can listen to episodes 30 and 31 with Dr. Stephen Hale if you want to know more about government bonds. But back to World War II, where you have a government spending to the limit of what its real economy could produce. And sorry, I know I say this every week, but someone's spending is someone else's income. And in this case, you can see that the government's huge spending is creating huge income for the private sector, with not a lot of goods being produced for the domestic market to spend that money on. In these circumstances, war bonds were used to defer the spending of the private sector until a time when there was enough supply to meet the increase in demand. So the US Treasury officials at this time understood these matters perfectly, but mostly the people who needed to sell the bonds and the public who really needed to buy the bonds to avert the inflation really had no time to educate themselves or others on the topic. So the ad campaigns at the time largely relied on different messaging, which we'll get into in the show. So we pick up where we left off in part one, talking about the simultaneous problems of high inflation coupled with high unemployment in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Thanks for listening.
So what do you think, Sam, would have been a better way to handle that immediate 2 years after the war had ended in the US? Because what we're saying there is you had high inflation and high unemployment, which goes against mainstream models as well, doesn't it? That you know, we always think of like, well, you know, we use it unemployment, you know, the Nairu idea, we use unemployment to fight inflation.
Yeah, you know, it's kind of funny. One of the, you know, the monetarist revolution in economics in the 70s and 80s, one of the reasons that one of the things they said that the Keynesians couldn't do was they couldn't explain stagflation. They couldn't explain how we could have inflation and unemployment at the same time. But if you look back to this era, actually, there were a few people saying that this could be a problem in the immediate post-war. And I think I put that in as a footnote in the paper. There's a quote from one of the Treasury officials where he says, like, in the early post-war period, we might have this issue of inflation and unemployment at the same time, even though we don't usually see them together. So there were some people who saw it coming, and it's really not true that Keynesianism couldn't understand stagflation. Maybe ISLM couldn't. I don't know. Anyway, so what to do about that issue? Well, really, what makes it difficult. I mean, we know what the solution is. The solution is the same stuff that you were using during the war to keep inflation down. It has to keep going after the war, right? It has to keep going. It has to keep going at least until the economy has reconverted enough to be able to supply consumer goods again. But it might even have to keep going a little bit longer than that too, or at least ramp down gently, as opposed to just stop the day the war is over.
So you have to keep building tanks and building weapons.
No. I just mean the inflation control measures. You have to keep taxes high. You have to keep people saving if you can. You might even need to continue the price controls and rationing kind of things, because there's in the early period, you know, when the reconversion is happening, when the factories are going from converting tanks to producing cars, then in that conversion period, there just still is not stuff to buy. Mm-hmm. So the government's not buying things anymore, or as many things, but there's still not consumer goods. So you still have to prevent people from trying to buy goods that don't exist. So you still have to try and, you know, keep taxes high, keep people saving so that they're not buying things yet. But then even after that period, the economy is now reconverted into producing consumer goods. We don't have a war economy anymore. We have a consumer economy again. You still have the issue of during the war, people had built up a lot of savings. You had been telling people to save their money for years and years, and now they saved money and now they want to spend the money. Yeah. And so that is a potential problem. You might have to, probably not nearly as bad as during the war, but it's something that, shouldn't lose sight of. And if we have a Green New Deal, it may be applicable as well. If we do this saving approach where we are encouraging mass saving in order to create fiscal space for the government to use more resources for the Green New Deal, then people will accumulate savings, which is definitely a good thing. But when the Green New Deal kind of ramps down and we enter normal peacetime afterwards, then people are going to have those savings and, want to spend them. And so, you do maybe need higher taxes than you might otherwise, depending on what's going on, and other measures too, credit controls and the things we talk about that, keep aggregate demand down, at least for a little while longer.
Right. Well, and so immediately after World War II, we've got the high inflation. We've talked about that a better policy would have been to keep the inflation controls in place and ramp them down more gently than they did. But that
and you hear, and I didn't include it in the paper, but you hear people say that exact thing. There's one quote from one of the people who worked in the Office of Price Administration, and there's basically a quote where he says, "If we let down the price controls early, then we will have inflationary chaos."
Right. Whoever that was didn't. They
did not win.
But anyway, those inflation controls would not have solved the unemployment, correct?
Oh no.
Yeah. So
definitely not.
So what would have been a good policy there? I mean, obviously I'm an MMTer. I'm like, job guarantee would have solved that. But I mean, what other things? Right. What other things?
I'd say there's probably two things that would address that. First of all, definitely the job guarantee, which is create, places for these people to work and do useful things and get paid, even while the private sector can't handle them yet. Right. So that's definitely a huge part of the solution. The second part is sort of good foresight. It's hard to do with a war. You don't know exactly when it's going to end. But with a Green New Deal, you can plan it a little better, and you can say, in the final stage of the Green New Deal, we expect to be doing X, Y, Z or whatever. And as, the need for Z ends, then the need for us to do X and Y to support Z will also be reduced, so we can ramp it down slowly. So instead of saying, January 1st, Green New Deal's over, thanks everybody and good night, we're saying, okay, for the next 6 months, we're going to be ramping down this and that. So those factories will start reconverting now. And then 6 months later, we won't need as many, as much production of this thing. So then those factories can be reconverting. So it's like a more gradual process, more controlled process of reconversion, as opposed to just, thank you and good night, war's over, you're on your own.
There is the other thing, of course, that a lot of women started working because the men were at war. Obviously, that increased the production capacity. After the war, presumably a lot of them went back to staying at home. And did that help with the unemployment? I mean, was there resentment from the men coming back from the war, perhaps?
I don't think I know how to answer that. Yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't really looked into that. That's a good question, though.
It is good because, I mean,
when displacement of a lot of workforce.
Yeah, because really what happened there is like what people talk about when they go, immigrants are coming over and taking our jobs. It's like, well, yeah, the workforce just
our
doubled.
wives are taking our jobs.
Exactly. The workforce.
These women.
No, but I often think about that because it's like, well, nobody everybody thought, oh, great, we've got we've got double the workforce now.
I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't resentment, because the mentality of the time was, different.
It's good. It's good that we've conquered sexism now, though.
Well,
it's completely over.
My turn to be totally uninformed. I'm just speculating here, just spitballing. But I would think you're probably right, Patricia. It probably wasn't that big of a problem because, for one thing, women went into the workforce knowing it was going to be temporary.
Mm-hmm.
That was kind of the social contract at that moment.
But some may have liked it. I mean,
yes, yeah, absolutely. And then
putting ideas into women's heads all of a sudden, this independence.
Before you know it, they're doing podcasts and all kinds.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe that was our economy during World War II was running at like unprecedented efficiency levels, and we did have a lot more women in the economy. So, what does that tell you? I don't know.
So we got to the point where it's over, and just more by default than design, the economy starts to become more functional, and I guess the golden era of capitalism, as it's called now, began. Am I right?
Yeah. And, a big part of that golden era, one of the things that created it that I try to emphasize in this paper is that saving during World War II, people saving money, paying down debt. If you look at private debt, it drops off a cliff during the war. It was, private debt kind of the same as now during the Great Depression. This was probably what triggered the Great Depression is the huge level of private debt that people were burdened with. And then during the war, the incomes were so much higher and there was nothing to buy. So people had to save their money and they paid down their debts, So people paying down debt and accumulating savings that fueled the post-war spending spree, that golden age of capitalism where demand and employment were kept high because people had money to buy things. It doesn't really sound like now, does it?
Well, I mean, we could flash forward to now, and I guess we should just talk about student debt cancellation for a second.
Okay.
Well, no, I just mean, does anybody think that's a bad idea? Anybody?
I don't think it's a bad idea, but if you just want me to look into my personal crystal ball, like take off my MMTer hat and put on my American I'm a voter so I get to have an opinion hat.
Yeah.
I think that student debt cancellation is a harder sell to the American public than some of the other progressive, platforms that I think a job guarantee is a surprisingly easy sell to the American public, to the voters, if not the vested interests. But as soon as people start listening to each other and like entertaining real ideas, I think that the job guarantee has got a pretty good chance. But student debt, I think, is a harder sell because, our conservative friends, it sort of violates their morality in a way that, jobs doesn't. Should it? No. But does it? Yes.
Right. Well, because I always think, that's conservatives. They're always it's going to be, it's the centrists that follow that logic as well. And it's like, well, you're not even a centrist right now. You're right wing on this. And that really frustrates me. This sort of like, well, if we cancel student debt, privileged people are going to get that cancellation too. And, it's like really sour grapes.
I heard as well that there was a lot of people who said, well, I've paid my student debt, so why should they not pay their student debt?
People are saying that, but I don't think that's really the issue. I mean, like that's the rationalization or whatever.
Yeah.
But if you think about that for a couple seconds, it's like total nonsense. Yeah. It's like somebody made the analogy to slavery. It's like, why should they get to be free because I had to be a slave? It's nonsense.
It's so unfair.
So I think that the really like root of the issue in the American psyche is just about this kind of thing about keeping your word and, like honor, that kind of deal. Like, debt cancellation, people view it as like, you've broken your promise or you're not,
You've like just reminded me of a something that Michael Hudson once said. You go there, the financial sector discovered this thing that, poor people pay their debts. And, and he goes, when Donald Trump can't pay his bills, he goes to the bank and he goes, I can't pay my debt. Yeah. You've got a problem. To the bank,
the rich don't have
here's how much I'm prepared to give you on the dollar. The different classes think about debt in a different way.
Right. How does that saying go? It's like, if you owe the bank $1,000, that's your problem. If you owe the bank $1 billion, that's the bank's problem.
Sure.
Yeah.
So and then you talk about in your paper the attempts to sell the government's message about thrift and stuff to thrift and saving and to the population, and also sort of analyzed whether it worked or not.
Yeah, they were trying. They were certainly putting out publications and saying things in speeches stuff, and it was in the newspapers, but they definitely were failing.
Right.
A lot of people did not get it.
Like unequivocally failing.
Yeah.
Right.
Part of it was that I think the messaging was not actually very good. So if you go and look at these like kind of war bond advertisements, like the one that I show in the paper, some of them are kind of say this stuff, this same kind of MMT flavored stuff, but then others are just like, Uncle Sam needs your dollars,
Yeah, very basic, a lot basic. And a lot more basic than
and also it works with the money story that people can relate to, the household analogy. Uncle Sam needs your money. So are you saying that the Uncle Sam needs your money story landed better with the population, even though it was not the right story?
Yeah, and so actually one of the reasons that one of the first things I found when I was writing this paper, like the way I got into this deeper, was this study by a guy named Cartwright, and I believe the paper is called Some Principles of Mass Persuasion, Selected Findings of Research on the Sale of United States War Bonds. So this is a guy who was running surveys for the U.S. government to try and figure out what people were thinking about war bonds. How did they think about the economy and about the money system and stuff? And, what he says is basically they were kind of trying to tell people it worked like this. It wasn't about the money. It was about inflation, but they didn't get it. And in surveys that they did, it was very clear that people were not getting it.
It makes me wonder, like maybe that they had trouble getting the message across because maybe the ad agencies, couldn't get it in their bones either. Maybe. Yeah,
I'd say that's true. I mean, for one thing, the Treasury was kind of dumbing stuff down that it's like people on the street could know what to do, like the people selling war bonds would know what to do. But then also, like, a lot of the advertisement didn't actually come from Treasury. It was very decentralized. And I think of something like $180 million worth of advertising space was donated to the Treasury. So I think some of that was people would say, hey, Treasury, here's some space. And then, Treasury would send something. And some of it was just other people would just write things, especially like banks would just write an advertisement encouraging people to buy war bonds because advertising on the Treasury's behalf makes you look patriotic, And
and their driver is to just sell the bonds, not an education campaign. It's
it's a means to an end.
That's true.
And that's kind of what it's kind of the problem we're up against now, that things. I think I very much admire Warren Mosler, and he was my introduction to MMT. And I didn't know. Big sharp. But I love the way he's obviously put a lot of thought into trying to say things in the simplest possible way, but no simpler.
He's really good at that.
And there's a and I think that's just the problem we've got, really.
But he's had years of practice and fail and practice.
Yeah. No, I mean,
it's hard. These things are. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I admire that about you as well, Sam. That's the way you do it when you're, when you're out there in the Twitter sphere. You realize you're you're talking to a human being that's got.
Your analogies are very good, and I think you are exemplary good at framing things in a simple way that everybody can understand them.
Well, thank you. I'm going to put that quote on my resume.
Yeah.
It's so tricky because it's like the principles that have to guide you, aren't necessarily reflected in anything you can see and touch. So, like, for instance, like I say in the paper over and over, the Treasury wanted people to save. If people would not buy consumer goods, then that would reduce the inflationary pressure. Okay, but so then you would think, so if you jump from there to like, how do we know people are saving? Well, if their savings goes up, they must be saving more, right? Well, no, it doesn't work like that at all. Like something like that sounds really, really simple like that doesn't work. It doesn't translate at all, because actually if we have inflation, then people's savings will go up because they're earning more money because prices are higher and their wages are higher and stuff. So if you were just using the size of savings as a goal to tell whether or not people are saving more, you'd be completely wrong. So this macroeconomics, like fallacy of composition issues, things that make sense in your personal life are like topsy-turvy, upside down when you look at the macro perspective. So that makes it hard.
Yeah, that was one of my early stumbling blocks when I was trying to get my head around MMT. The statement that the government sector's deficit is the private sector's surplus. So, private sector savings go up to the penny by what the deficit goes up to the penny. Otherwise, somebody's made a mistake. And I was when people started talking about private sector savings, and I was watching and listening to lectures and reading books about this stuff, I was like thinking savings as in savings accounts. Like I have a checking and a savings, or a current account and a savings account. And I was like, well, why would my savings account go up because the deficit went up? And it took me a while to go, no, the definition of savings is everything the private sector's got in all its bank accounts, and like that's what you're saying. That's kind of what you just said then, which is, we're talking about, we want people to not spend their money. That's different to private sector savings. Those savings can still be moving through the economy and creating inflation. It's the flow that's creating the inflation. Yeah.
It's like this fallacy of composition thing. If I save more, then I have more savings. So does that mean that if everybody saves more, there will be more savings? No, it doesn't. If I save more, I have more savings, but that's because I didn't buy anything from you. So now you have less savings. I just basically took it from you, so yeah.
I like the way Stephanie Kelton talked about this on the paradox of thrift, right? It's called,
exactly.
So I found that as an extremely good way of explaining MMT to my family. I just explained because my mum has her own business, and so I said, we are told save, but if everybody does it at the same time, the economy comes to a halt effectively.
That's exactly right. And I just saw somebody on Twitter right before you guys called, and the person was saying like, MMT is nonsense. I have a small business, and I knew that you have to earn more than you spend. That's how you do, business or whatever. And I'm writing back like, everybody can't earn more than they spend. Like where does it come from?
Yeah, that was kind of my in point with MMT, and it was a similar experience to what you went through, I imagine, Sam, when you said you got interested around about 2008. Well, same for me. It's like we were told it's a global financial crisis. So the money disappeared from the globe. Right. It's like, well, where did it go then? Did Martians take it? Did it? Do you know what I mean? What happened did that hole in the ozone layer let the money out?
There were comedians mentioning exactly that, saying we are apparently the globe is this much in debt. But to whom? It's and I wondered at the time why they hadn't followed on from that Like they were just happy to end.
Well, that's the problem with being a comedian. Once you get the laugh, it's like get out.
That's
if you say anything else, you're just going to mess it up.
Stop thinking now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right, so I've got the quote here if you guys want to hear this.
Yeah.
This is so what we were talking about before was this fellow Cartwright, and he's writing about how people, the government was trying to explain the way they were thinking, and people weren't getting it. And so they were doing surveys to ask people what they thought. And so here's what he says. He says, in the course of the research program, considerable attention was given to the nature of popular thinking about the functioning of the economy and the role of war bonds in the prevention of inflation. From this analysis, it became clear, for example, why the promotion designed to explain the government's interest in bond sales as a means of inflation control did not succeed in changing popular thinking. It became apparent that for many people, war finance was simply seen as the collection of dollars by Uncle Sam, which were then paid by him to the manufacturers of war goods. So he's saying if people thought if Uncle Sam sold the bonds, he could buy equipment. If he did not sell them, he could not get the supplies. So he's saying that's what people thought, but it was wrong. The government was selling these war bonds because it wanted people to save. Right?
So at some point they're just making the decision. Look, we've got to, we've got to get these things. We've got to get the war bonds sold. So, the means justify the ends. We haven't got time to go. Send a bunch of people around giving speeches and re-educating. Let's just do it. It's easier to do it this way.
But is that ominous? I mean, it sounds ominous because it sounds like what it's saying is, selling this, this idea as a means of inflation control doesn't work. What does that do for us?
I think, MMT's got an advantage over them, which is they just kind of had this ad hoc, here's how we think it works now based on our experience. But MMT has got a bigger, theoretical, framework to ground all this stuff in, that. And when I write in the paper, what they were saying, a lot of it, basically all of it was compatible with MMT, but it's not the same as MMT. Because MMT goes farther. MMT has got this chartalism. It's got the credit theory of money. We're saying money is a government IOU. We're saying every dollar that the government spends, it's just issuing IOUs. That is like a paradigm shift in a way that it goes farther than just this. And so, on the one hand, that makes maybe our task harder, but on the other hand, maybe it makes it easier because like I said earlier, if you can get people to switch to this different analogy, to think about IOUs or gift cards instead of hunks of gold, then the light bulb goes off. People start making connections on their own. It all falls into place and it makes sense. Whereas in this, people had their conception of money. They weren't, people remembered the gold standard. It was just a few years earlier. And so they were thinking of money like that. And so this stuff on top of that, it still works, but it's hard to wrap your head around because then you're like, why is the government different? And what about printing money? That used to be a big problem, so it's harder to wrap your brain around. So I think, in that sense, the fact that we've got a broader paradigm that makes it all make sense, that encapsulates it all, that situates it, is helpful for us.
How would you explain? I mean, you just mentioned the phrase "printing money," and which comes up a lot in debate recently, and it seems to be interpreted or defined in different ways, and I think that causes confusion sometimes. Because I consider it mostly a political term, but how would you define it? I mean, within the context of the gold standard, how would you define printing money? And after the gold standard, what is printing money?
Yeah, good question. So, during the gold standard, and especially, during the gold standard, I think it was a little more appropriate to say something like the government needs to tax to spend. Now, I wouldn't say that the tax dollars paid for the government spending, because, it's the same as now. The money is a gift card. It's a coupon. The government writes an IOU, and that's called currency, right? When it spends, and it gets them back and shreds them when it receives taxes. But the money that you have, the currency in a gold standard is convertible into gold. So people can come to the government and say, hey, I'd like to redeem this dollar. Please give me some gold. And if the government doesn't have enough gold to be able to do that for everybody who comes to ask, then they've got a big problem. Like the system falls apart. People show up and they're angry and they're like, where's our gold or whatever, And so the one way that the government could try to prevent that was basically to lock up this money so that people couldn't convert it into gold. And the way they do that is by selling treasury bonds, or what people conventionally call borrowing. You sell a bond, so you take the currency away from somebody and you give them another piece of paper that is almost identical but says, security on it instead of currency, and it's not convertible into gold. So now you basically still got the money, but in a form that's not convertible into gold. So your gold is a little bit safer, right? So in that system, the government it's like the government has a vested interest in selling these bonds, getting them out there and taking currency out of circulation as much as it can to keep its gold safe so that people don't show up and demand the gold. And so this fear of quote unquote printing money was more legitimate. Like if the government stopped selling bonds and was issuing currency or just not removing currency by not selling bonds, then there's more currency outstanding. The government's gold reserves are more at risk. There could be a crisis where the gold standard collapses because people want the gold and the government can't give it to them. Mm-hmm. Today, we don't have any of that, right? So, if you want to hold your savings or you want to hold them in currency, you want to hold your savings in currency or you want to hold them in treasury bonds, like the government doesn't care, who cares? The gold is not at risk. It's not promising to give you any gold. So it doesn't need to take that currency out and replace it with treasury securities because that doesn't do anything. There's like some slight differences in terms of like interest being paid. So, if you have currency that you saved, like you said, you probably want, instead of just the money, you want the money that earns money. You'd probably rather have a treasury security than currency. Which is kind of at this issue of where people say like, well, what if investors get spooked and the government can't borrow? Well, like, no, that's not how it works. I mean, what's the alternative? They're just going to hold paper money? Like, no, they're not.
So to you, and in the way I believe you mentioned it in your paper once, the term printing money. To you, printing money, and to me, to be honest, is the same definition, which is what would be government spending without an equivalent bond issuance, deficit spending without an equivalent bond issuance.
Yeah, I think this term is so loaded that I try to avoid it whenever possible, or at least put it in scare quotes,
It is, yeah. It is very loaded, but often I see it used in reference to QE, for example, and people have this idea that only the central bank prints money through QE, and then it gets really confusing. But mostly I find it to be a political term, and they try to associate it with ideas, historical hyperinflation, Weimar, etc., but also with ideas of illegitimacy. That somehow the printed dollar.
Well, I think the answer is to that is there's no two sets of dollars, like the real ones and the printed fake ones, and as Warren Mosler says, if government spending is printing money, the taxing is unprinting of money, and it's that simple, right?
Yeah, and people think that when government prints money, it's actually physical as well.
Like, but what can you,
well, they
do
take it
that?
literally. So it's just a minefield.
Like I said, it's all about analogies for me. If people think if their mental model of money is as a chunk of gold, basically, then there is something that feels illegitimate about the government, marking up accounts or printing paper money or whatever. They're tampering with the system that works naturally without them. This is what all the Bitcoin people are always saying. But if you realize that
these are Bitcoin people, it's like the thing you're the thing you're hyping right now. That's a synthetic thing. It's not. That's not dug out of the ground. Out of all the people in the world, you cannot be lecturing me about this, right?
Right. That's artificial scarcity. That's not even
exactly
natural scarcity. But if you get people to realize that the money is not a chunk of gold, it is a relationship. It's an IOU. It's this debt between you and government. It's a coupon that the government issues. Then, that kind of evaporates. Like, you say the government should not print money. Well, what do you mean? Like Macy's shouldn't sell coupons? Like, what do you mean? It's like
another thing that I've been thinking about recently. When every now and again I'll talk to somebody about MMT, and they'll be like, "Yeah, all right, I get it. Money's just made up. Like it's not real, or it's manufactured, it's artificial." And I'm like, "Yeah, but that doesn't mean it's not important. Like, you've got a car and you've got an insurance document. So you've got an arrangement with an agency that's regulated and whatever, and it runs to some pages, right? That insurance policy, that's just made up. It has real consequences. You can choose to print it out, put it in a drawer, or you can not print it. You can have it as a PDF. You can have it as lines of code somewhere in the internet. It takes all of those forms, but what it actually is a contract between you and another entity. And that's what money is, so that's, and by saying that, I'm not saying it's not important or made up, or, the government are just playing tricks on us. It's like they're coming to an arrangement with us, or, that arrangement is legitimized by the fact that you hopefully live in a democratic society, and they're using their money system to move resources from the private sector to the public sector, that in a way that you get things done that you voted on, that you wanted done. But that's what it is. It's an arrangement,
Yeah, I mean, the whole economy is promises. It's made up of promises from one group to another of some kind. And the government actually is different. And the difference is not that it's some magical whatever. The difference is that the government has the use of force, violence, I cannot go break somebody's legs if they, don't pay me back my own coupon.
Mate, don't put yourself down. I think you could break someone's legs.
I left my crowbar at home. But
I'm saying if you can dream it. I mean, you said you were an optimist a while ago.
Right. Someday. Yeah, but
that could be a great talk that you could put on at the MMT conference.
Obviously, Sam, you're invited over here, and me and Christian will take you to have fish and chips.
And then we'll find some conservatives whose legs you can break.
You know what? Well, okay. Just let me put this pitch in here, because I not to make it too serious, but I do think that the world needs a lot more empathy. So I consider the conservatives my friends is what I'm saying. And I'm not saying we should ignore injustice, and I'm not saying we should ignore oppression or anything like that. We need to stand up, and people deserve to be treated as equals and everything. And people deserve equity, liberation. But still, it's like we need to think of each other as being on the same team. We're on the same team with the people who disagree with us, and we're on the same team with the people who need help and the people who should be helping. And I think the more people think like that, the better. So I'm sorry to steal your joke, your punchline, but
no, not at all. I think that the way that value that you have is why you're so good on social media. You see the other empathy. You see the other person that you're talking to as being on the same team.
Well, thank you. And I mean, I really think that we're not going to get, the reason that I'm all in on this MMT thing is because I see it as like the idea that we have to stand on if we want to get anywhere. Until we have conversations with each other in terms that make sense, then we're not going to get anywhere. And we're never going to have those conversations until we first decide that those conversations are worth having.
Yes.
So this thing where people say you'll never convince them, or it's not worth it, or even those people are evil. Well, some people are evil, but most of them are not. And I might not convince you today on Twitter, but people need to be talking to each other and just need to think of each other as being on the same team. I'm totally adamant about that. That I've been saying for years that if we still want a United States of America in 1 decade, then we got to get serious about thinking of each other as human beings.
We need a little bit of that attitude here as well, to be honest. I mean,
can I just jump in and say, even though I joked about it, I've never broken anybody's legs, and I don't advocate it as well. I
you want to make a public
I just want
apology.
to. I'm sorry. I've let myself down, but anyway, look, let's get back to the MMT, right? So,
well, that was a good disclaimer because the CIA is listening, and there would have been someone outside your house.
They've got us tapped.
Patricia's got this thing where she tells Google to turn on her lights in the house, and so we're definitely on some watch list now because
it was a gift.
I always think if I've got a secret or something, I just put it in a podcast. Hardly anybody listens to them. So
okay, you've given me things to think about.
So back to like we're on the same team, even though we might have different points of view. I think a big thing that's kicking off at the moment, to bring it back to the present day, the one thing that's really popping right now is UBI and the Yang Gang. And they really do feel like the job guarantee and MMT informed politics are in opposition to UBI. And I just wondered, I know you've probably had a lot of online conversations with people about this. I just wonder what your take was, how best to talk about these two things, and what do you think?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think this whole, a lot of this conversation is steered in this either or direction that I think is not terribly helpful. I mean, there's definitely a way to, it's not either or. I mean, a job guarantee and a UBI, they do different things and they serve different purposes, and there's really no reason we can't have both. I do think that we need to be especially wary of a bad UBI, but we also need to be wary of a bad job guarantee. I mean, if UBI is going to get used to replace other programs, like, okay, you can have a UBI and we're going to cancel Social Security, cancel unemployment insurance, cancel cancel this, that, and the other thing. That's not good. And then, we shouldn't be trumping up UBI to like it's going to do more than it can. I mean, UBI can't create full employment, right? It just doesn't do that. That's not what UBI does. So there's that. I mean, UBI also, the effect on inequality, I mean, giving more income to people who need it is definitely a good thing. But then on the other hand, you give $1,000 a month to a rich person, they're just going to save it in an investment, and now they're earning interest on it. Or you give it to a poor person and they've spent it all on, the necessaries of life. And so, you might, help with income inequality and worsen wealth inequality, So I don't know, kind of issues like that. Like the Yang Gang folks see the UBI as like a panacea, which it's not. I mean, and then another thing, one view that I've come across is like sort of combining the worst of both worlds here, which is viewing UBI as a panacea and then using like monetarism to justify why it's not going to be inflationary. It's like, okay, if governments tax the wealthy to get the money, then they're not printing money, so it's not going to cause inflation. Well, that's totally wrong. I mean, like we've been talking about this whole episode, this inflation issue is about competing demands for goods and services, trying to buy more stuff than we can produce. And the thing about raising taxes on the wealthy is, the wealthy, first of all, there's not very many of them. And second of all, they don't spend a huge proportion of their income. So you raise taxes drastically on the wealthy, you might not actually have reduced demand for goods and services very much. Meanwhile, a UBI is going to give a lot of money to poor people, which of course is a good thing because they'll go and spend it, improve their living standards. But that's a dramatic increase in demands for goods and services. So it's like, even if we raised the dollar amount of dollars from rich people and to equal how much we're giving poor people, or just everybody, I guess, in the UBI, that could still be extremely inflationary. Like this quote unquote printing money monetarist logic is way off base on that. And there's one kind of UBI that I would argue is definitely guaranteed, like basically by definition, to be inflationary, which is the living wage UBI. Yeah. So that's like we offer people so much money that they actually have a very serious option not to work at all. Now, the problem with that is, okay, so like presumably if we're offering, if we're going to offer people this option not to work, the goal is that at least some people, take up that option, right? And they say like, okay, this is an option, and so I'm going to take it. I'm not going to work anymore. Well, so the UBI is giving money to people. They'll use it to buy goods and services. That's a huge increase in aggregate demand for real resources. At the same time as we're, saying to people, you don't need to work. That's a decrease in the supply of goods and services. So, you look at your little Econ 101 supply demand diagram, demand goes up, supply goes down. Like, what happens to price? It goes up. That is by definition inflationary. So I'm not for that. But personally, I would not be opposed to a small UBI. I mean, I think that could do a lot of good.
As you were talking, I think I've been making a mistake, because I've been thinking, when I'm dealing with somebody that's very into UBI, I'm thinking they've come through all the MMT hurdles, so they know the government's got the money, and really they're saying, yeah, give me the money to live on, but why are you demanding work off me? So I've been sort of thinking about addressing that mindset, but I realise now because I've been answering some of this by going, well, what you're doing there is you're saying you need the tokens to spend, the government's tokens to spend, and by taking them, you're saying, yeah, I need to consume stuff, and by taking them and not doing any work, you're saying I need to consume stuff, but I don't care who produces the stuff I consume as long as it's not me. So, and I just think that, that we're, because then that gets around the whole, oh, well, robots are doing everything, so we should all just take the rest of our lives off. And it's like, obviously robots aren't doing everything. So, and also, exactly, but yeah, they're never going to be doing everything. But they're definitely not now. So if you institute it now, who decides who gets to take the rest of their lives off? Because if you look around at your life and your house and the things that are in it and what you eat and what you look at and the entertainment you consume, everything to do with your life has been produced. You're saying you're not going to contribute to that at all. It should all just be laid on for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think like some of the people who support UBI wholeheartedly are like, some of the reasoning behind that could be that they've been in a lot of pretty lousy jobs, and I've of course done that myself, and going like, this is horrible, and there could be a better way in life. Something, it should be more meaningful than this.
It must feel like torture.
Right, totally. Mm-hmm. And I'm very sympathetic to that. But to me, the solution there is not necessarily to cancel work. It's to create better jobs. Like, we're always, first of all, not only, people need meaning in their life, and at least some chunk of that meaning comes from your relationship to the community and you contributing to it. So I don't think that's going to go away ever. But also, like, no matter, even the most techno optimist people, it's like, imagine whatever world you want with the most automation, most robots, whatever you want, and nobody's doing any work. Okay. Now take that same world and we're using people's skills in some fashion to make it better. right?
Yeah.
So if unless you're telling me that there will be a future where it is completely impossible to improve the human existence through human labor, then there will always be people working, and we will want them to work because that will make our lives better, right? So the change we need to make is to create avenues for that to happen that don't like really suck, that aren't like socially isolating and disempowering and like make people feel like worthless and make people stupid. And, we want jobs where people feel like they have control. People feel like they're connected to the other people in their community and their friends and neighbors and stuff. People feel like they're making the world a better place. People like are challenged and grow on the job as opposed to just like do the same thing day in, day out for years and years. Like that's what we want.
And this is where I find it really interesting because you start getting quite close to that almost philosophical question of what is it that makes us happy? What do you want? What do you want to happen? Yeah. I went to in the building industry, there is a lot of talk about making, buildings more sustainable and what does that mean to people and bringing communities together. And they mentioned there that, trying to get feedback from people as to what is it that they wanted, was tricky in various sense because partly it was really difficult to reach them sometimes, especially those that were unemployed and didn't interact very much with their communities. But also because apparently people are very bad at articulating what they want, and you need somebody to interpret or read between the lines.
I mean, maybe part of that is our work culture. We go we have life, and we're happy when we're living life. We go on holiday, we do whatever we want, and then we have work. It's totally different, and therefore you spend more time at work than you spend outside of it generally these days. And because that's and then that tends to inform you don't really get time to go, how could this be better? What do I actually want out of life? Really, what I want is the paycheck to show up, and then I'll go and live my life with the bits of time left over, maybe. And that's why people hate work, and they sort of think that job guarantee advocates are saying, more of that. We want. Whereas I'm saying, hey, look, if automation's taken away, a certain percentage to the extent where we can just have a 4-day week, then the job guarantee job is a 4-day week. We can set that minimum standard through the job guarantee. It's the public option. Anyway, so I am rambling on. I apologize.
No, you just made me think about something. Are you keen on John Berger, Sam?
What was the name?
John Berger is a writer here, philosopher. I've heard of him. He wrote a book called Ways of Seeing, which is mostly about art, but he mentions something, talks about the role of advertisement in generally in capitalism and why advertisement is as successful as it is. And he mentioned something that really resonated to me in relation to our relationship with work. And it basically says that the role of marketing is ideal in a society that has kind of moved towards freedom and democracy, but stopped halfway there. And he talks about this idea that the work itself, that the people are working. Work is toil to them and boring and consumption then and glamour is really a symbol of what they wish they could be doing instead of what they're doing. So he just mentions the working self envies the consuming self. And they live in this kind of daydreaming state, and advertisement aids in that daydreaming state.
Yeah. I mean, it's coping, right? It's like the world is tough, and you got to figure out a way to mentally deal with that and make sense of it. And maybe 100 years ago, when people were working, or I guess 150 years ago, when people were working like 14-hour days in factories, that was especially something people had to do. And when we needed everybody to toil on farms to produce a livelihood for us, maybe we need a little more coping, but even then, I think, things could have been arranged better, could have been arranged to create more dignity and more autonomy. And especially now that jobs are mostly services and not sort of backbreaking labor. And, more and more people are thinking to themselves, why does this suck so much? Like, why is this so, difficult and so isolating and not fun to be in? Mm-hmm. It's much easier to imagine an alternative way to arrange things, to get the same stuff done, but, have it be more meaningful.
A couple of beats ago, you said something. You said you would be, you could get behind a UBI and a job guarantee at the same time. Now, did you mean basic income and a job guarantee rather than UBI?
I'm not necessarily opposed on political grounds to the just give money to everybody approach. I mean, I feel like just as a general rule, universal programs are better, for political reasons. That being said, if we're going to do that, we have to keep in mind what a UBI would and would not do. In terms of inequality, UBI is not some sort of panacea. Could even make it worse. Depending on what the details are. Right. So, yeah. But just as a general rule, I'm one of those lefties that prefers this universality element, universal programs. Give something to everybody, and then that way we don't create as many enemies.
Yeah, that's good way to think about it. But I was just wondering how UBI and a job guarantee could work together.
You just mean BI and a job guarantee?
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, because generally, when you go down that road, the next thing that's got to happen is, well, somebody's going to have to, taxes are going to have to go up on some people, so it loses its universality.
Yeah.
I'm just asking you how you think it would play out, UBI sitting beside a job guarantee.
I guess you could think of it this way. So what the job guarantee does is it moves the labor slack in the economy from unemployment to employment. Like the same, approximately the same number of people that we have to keep unemployed to prevent inflation. That's been the strategy for the last few decades. Move them into employment. They're still kind of doing a similar role, so to speak, but now they're employed. So it moves the labor slack from unemployment to employment. What a basic income would do in this, its relationship here is to reduce that labor slack, because you're increasing demand for goods and services. So that would take up some of that slack.
But you could achieve the same thing with a tax cut, right?
Yeah, more or less.
But it might even be
the
easier to
distribution
achieve.
is different. It's the distribution is different.
Right.
Well, okay. Let me rephrase this. I don't think UBI. We don't want it because it'll stimulate the economy, right? That's not a really great reason necessarily to have a UBI. Does that get closer to what you were getting at?
Yeah. No, well, I just feel like it's kind of everybody that I speak to that's kind of talks about UBI, when you drill down into it, they start talking about taxes and there's a tax plan to make it fairer so that nightmare situation doesn't happen where the rich people invest it, and because they don't need to spend it, they invest it, and bubbles happen, and employers at the low end go, well, we can pay you less now because you get $1,000 a month. They pretty quickly, when you start poking those holes into UBI, the person you're talking to will go, well, tax, the next thing they'll say is tax. And I'm like, well, so you're not really talking about universal basic income. You actually,
I see what you're saying.
Effectively you're talking about basic income.
It's one of those things where it depends on how big it is, sure. How much aggregate demand is going to increase relative to the economy at that time. Yeah. Let me put it this way. There's some policies where it's like two versions of the policy are identical in like final outcome, but the intermediate steps are different and it makes a difference. So UBI, if you had to also raise taxes to fight inflation or whatever, okay, so then some people like net functionally aren't getting a basic income, right? Mm-hmm. Like you just said. However, there is something like symbolically and politically important about mailing out the checks, even if on net, they don't actually benefit. And I mean, I think even MMT is like semi on board with that in terms, if we're talking about separating taxes from spending, I don't mean with the UBI, I just mean with this like principle of like the political importance of separating these things.
Yeah.
If we're talking about separating the taxes from the spending, well, the spending is the UBI, the taxes, we may or may not need taxes depending on what's going on. And if we do, they're to fight inflation. It's like a separate thing, so we decide with the UBI, we would be deciding like everybody has access, should get access to like this minimum level of real resources, whether they work or not, and then we say, now there's now given that maybe that's going to be an inflation problem. Now with the tax side, we decide these people should have fewer access, less access or whatever. They still have above the minimum.
So you're still going to have to discriminate at some point. I know that it's a powerful idea that like universal stuff just it appeals. It's easier to sell, but I guess the way that some UBI advocates have talked about it that I've seen is the problem with the job guarantee is we don't trust that. It's complicated. It raises too many questions. Obviously they've not read any of the literature. They've not read Pavlina's fantastic FAQ page, which answers flipping everything, right? And they're going, oh, it's too complicated, and we can't trust the government to do it right. It's going to have to be, and then you start talking to them about how their UBI is going to work, and you start talking about inflation and the problem with everybody getting it, and then they start talking about taxes, and well, obviously this person's going to be paying more tax, and it's like, right, so
it's getting more complicated now.
You don't trust them to implement this universal job guarantee scheme. Because it's too complicated. But this thing you're still talking about seems way more complicated, and guess what? It involves raising taxes on people. It involves raising taxes on the people that are least likely to like it and have the most political clout to get it squished out. So talk to me again about viability and dealing with political realities and being pragmatic,
Totally. Although it's interesting, if you look at who supports the UBI, you get a lot of those like tech bro CEO types who are like, they want the wage subsidy basically.
Yeah, exactly.
There is there is an interesting article that was actually the reason behind a Twitter storm. Which was his MMT America First Economics by Gerald Epstein. And, he makes various accusations, one of which I found particularly troubling, which was that MMT did not consider production to be an issue, that effectively what we were saying was that that it would increase demand in the US to the point where, America would exploit developing nations and their resources and suck them all up, and that was the implication, I guess. But you wouldn't, obviously a job guarantee doesn't have that risk, but with a UBI perhaps, do you think there is a risk of that?
Of sucking resources from other nations?
Yeah.
You kind of get into this issue of like, what should our trade policy be? Which, is a huge can of worms that we probably shouldn't go into, and I'm probably the wrong person to ask about it anyway. But well, first of all, the idea that MMT is America First economics is just absolute crap. We have so many people in other countries who are MMTers.
Yeah, exactly.
How could it be America First economics? Like, you're on the phone with me right now.
Exactly.
Like
they ignore us,
but they ignore Bill Mitchell. It's like,
and they ignore all the people from Latin America who are into it as well, and everybody in Europe, because MMT doesn't apply to Europe apparently. But the Spanish MMTers are very upset to hear about that.
Yeah.
But,
the question of, so any kind of economic stimulus that puts more money in people's hands, is maybe going to cause them to import more, which, gets into this trade policy thing. And so I don't feel like you can have the conversation kind of in a vacuum. It kind of needs to be in the grounds of like, what should our next global trade system be? And I don't know that MMT has really tackled that in too much depth yet.
There's definitely further to go, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, you hear talk about like the Bancor plan, Keynes's Bancor plan sometimes. But yeah, I mean, where MMT goes on those issues, I'm not sure yet. The question is like, what is the next Bretton Woods system going to be? Like, how do we, what is our attitude? What should it be to these, to like trade imbalances? Like, are they good, bad? Should we be doing something to reduce them? And I'd say the sort of default position in MMT, and I want to say this is a starting place. Like, this is not like the final word. So like a lot of people hear this phrase and they go, what are you talking about? But, so the starting place for thinking about this is that imports are a benefit and exports are a cost, sort of all else equal. And basically, and all that's saying is when we import stuff, that's real resources coming in. When we export stuff, that's real resources that we don't get to enjoy. That's like we built a car in Detroit and we sold it somewhere else. So we spent the labor, but they get the car, so that's a cost in real terms. Yeah. Now people hear that and they go, what are you talking about? That's too simple. That's missing all this stuff. And I agree. That doesn't nearly capture, all other kinds of important things, but it's not meant to. It's sort of it's just a starting place for thinking about stuff. This is all else equal kind of statement. There's all kinds of things you put on top of that. Things like, nationally important resources we want to produce here, even if we could get them abroad. Maybe we want to produce our missiles here because we don't trust the other people that we might buy them from.
Yeah, maybe China will stop sending them at some point.
Exactly. We don't want to be dependent,
or send them in a different way.
But that MMT declaration of exports being a cost and imports being a benefit, it freaks people out. And I think the reason why that happens, at least the initial reaction, is because they don't admit it perhaps out loud, but we've been taught the exact opposite. We're accustomed to see it in exactly the opposite way. So it's like a mirror, almost an exact mirror image of what we understand it to be.
Totally.
I always think we just got to go, no, we're talking about real stuff.
Exactly.
As opposed to nominal stuff, nominal wealth. As soon as you could say that.
I think it's jobs, is what people are thinking about. They're going like, if we export more, then we'll have more jobs here, so we should export more. But the MMT is saying, well, let's have a job guarantee. So then that takes the jobs things off the table.
We'll have all the jobs we need because they're guaranteed.
It's this idea that jobs are scarce, right? Which is kind of nonsense if you think about it. Like, there's no shortage of work, So, and then there's other elements to it too. It's like, one thing that I've been kind of thinking a little bit about for a while is like, our policy, like our development policies, should not just be focusing on growth and jobs, but also on the quality and type of jobs. Like, if we want to create jobs, they should be the kind of jobs that our people like doing, and maybe jobs that we could do, but we don't want to, like they kind of suck. Maybe, we could use this thing that everybody seems to still love called a market and go, right, this thing that sucks that people don't want to do, we'll reward that a bit more because people don't want to do it, right?
Well, and then robots should take care of
it. But then they're getting paid more, they can do less of it and, have more leisure time, and that's their trade-off,
right now, right now people who, jobs that people don't want to do get foisted off on the people with no power. Yeah. It's like low income immigrants are like janitors in this country or like fast food restaurant chefs or whatever, because, they don't have the power to say no to those jobs. So like, that's part of what the job guarantee is changing those power dynamics so that there is a viable alternative, so that people have the power to say, I'm not going to do that, and to maybe transform some of those jobs or at least pressure those jobs to become better paying, more dignified jobs.
We'll start wrapping up now then. So any closing remarks, and then we'll go on to like where people can find you.
Okay. Well, shameless plug, read the paper.
Yeah, of course.
It's definitely a work in progress. So if people have feedback or additional knowledge or something's not clear, I'm happy to take that. It's it was really mind blowing for me to do this research, just digging through all this materials and finding just quote after quote where I'm like, am I reading the U.S. government in 1942, or am I reading Stephanie Kelton or Warren Mosler could have written this stuff? It's wild.
I think we'll add a link to the paper, but it's titled Modern Money and the War Treasury, and it's published by the Global Institute of Sustainable Prosperity.
Out as a working paper. So yeah, it was a lot of fun to write. And I guess like just echoing the kind of concluding section of the paper, like the paper kind of goes through these different aspects of the monetary system, taxes and borrowing and whatever, and kind of assembles what the Treasury was thinking about those. But then in the last section of the paper here, it's like cause for optimism, and I think there is a lot of cause for optimism despite the dark times, which is that I think we do have this unrealized potential, this reserve capacity that people do not even realize is there, this like untapped potential. And I think we can and must and will put that to work to get some real stuff done, some real change done. I'm pretty optimistic about it. It's going to take work. Like, every person who's listening needs to realize that they have a personal stake in this stuff and in, making change happen. Like I've been thinking a lot lately about like what I guess I'm calling the work of society. Like society does not just magically exist and stay together. It takes like active effort, labor to like keep society from crumbling and falling apart. And, every one of us needs to be thinking about how we can do that in this era of strife, like how we can build support for popular change and make people rethink the world and realize that there's more possible than they might have thought, and be more optimistic about the future. Mm-hmm. Can I read you this quote here? It's a little long, but this is it's in the paper, and it's actually two quotes, and it's from Walter Lippmann, a journalist at the time who's definitely controversial himself. But he was one of the people who during the war really got it, really got what the Treasury was saying. And there's one column that I would definitely say, if there's any one takeaway from the paper, or any one source from the paper you might like to read more, it's probably this. He wrote a column that was called The ABCs of War Finance, early in the war. And it's like, this guy got it, and you don't see as many journalists doing that today, although there are some. But okay, so here's what he says. He says, and this was about midway through the war. He said, "What we are seeing, therefore, for the first time is how far away any American has been from realizing the true potentialities of the country once there is a determined effort to draw upon its hidden, neglected, and unrealized reserves. A dog which suddenly grew to be as big as a horse would no longer be treated as a big dog, and its proud master would find he had to change his ideas and feelings about dogs. We shall find that in our presence of this demonstration of American productivity, the change of scale, the new order of the magnitude of things, will compel us to re-examine almost all our common assumptions on such matters as taxes, the national debt, tariffs, international commerce, finance, imports, exports, and investment." And he says in another piece, "Somehow it has come to be understood that the capacity to produce is the real wealth of a nation, and that its national debt is not a measure of the nation's or even of its government's economic position."
Wow, that could be an MMT pitch right there.
You're on Twitter, and it's at Deficit Owls, and I don't think anybody listening doesn't know you from that. But
I just started like a personal Twitter because for a while I've been, I try to keep I try to keep the deficit owls thing like sort of vaguely politically neutral and also like too MMT relevant stuff. And, there's too many things where I'm like, I want to tweet this, but I can't do it as deficit owl. So
you're too disciplined.
I try.
Yeah.
And I guess I should also say there is some alternate universe where deficit owls is like not just me. Like there are a couple people who help me with deficit owls.
I am sorry that I didn't know that. I am sorry.
No. It's okay. I mean, it's just that we're all so busy and we haven't had time. And so we're all very ambitious. We'd like it to do a lot more. We just haven't been able to get it together yet. So if people want to volunteer to help out deficit owls, that would be fantastic. We do have projects we'd love to do.
Great.
Especially with things like video making and writing and things like that. Is that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's memes to make. There's videos to cut. We want to do things like organize meetings and things so people in like local communities can talk about this stuff. And, there's this Modern Money Meme Week thing. And there's other things that we have in mind. One of the things I envisioned from the beginning was that it would be a little more activism based, like getting people to do things, write letters to Congress, show up at somebody's office, host learning parties or whatever. Like that's what I'd really like it to be. I just don't have the time to make it happen. But definitely I want to give a shout out while I'm here to the other people who do help me with deficit owls, especially Bill. So
we completely
who is
relate
that, Bill?
On Twitter, it's TXEX.
Yeah, I know who you mean. Yeah. Okay. And
I'm sorry, I'm just going to say it is literally a bill, like a note.
Yeah.
I didn't catch that. Right. Sorry, carry on.
That's good. I always like visual humor in our audio podcast.
No, it's just on his Twitter account. It says, "I'm a bill." Yes, I'm only a bill. And it just caught me out off guard. I'm sorry.
Yeah. That's Bill Peoples. He's great people. If you see him at the MMT conference, say thank you.
Okay. All right.
We will.
Well, I'll say no. Thank you, Bill. What's the best channel for a person who's listening to this who thinks, hey, I've got some time. I understand MMT. I want to get the word out. I'd like to help deficit owls. What's the best channel for them to contact you, to message you on Twitter, or is it, is there something better than that? Anything
is fine. Message me on Twitter. That's totally cool.
Great. All right then. Well, hopefully there'll be, because robots are doing everything. So there's people with loads of spare time.
Deficit owls is actually a robot.
It's Blade Runner. So Sam, thank you so much for all this time you've given us, and you're so good at talking about these things. It's going to make a great episode.
Thank you. Hey, it's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me on. I'm delighted to come back, in the future if you'd like to.
And, we'd love that.
And thank you guys for doing this podcast. It's a great addition to our community. So thrilled to have it. Thank you for your hard work.
It's our pleasure. I'm
making us blush.
Okay, great to talk to you.
Have
Thanks,
a good evening.
You too.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.
It's a lot of political news out there, huh?
Yeah, just a bit crazy at the moment.
You guys still have a government or what?
No, there's no government.